Hello, welcome to the video lecture on T.S.Eliot and his critical contributions. Thomas Sterne Eliot can be considered to be one of the most influential figures in the literary field of the 20th century. He was a multifaceted genius who excelled as a poet, a playwright, a journalist, and a critic. And as a critic, Eliot can be considered as an iconoclast who established a new critical paradigm, a new critical idiom. He was somebody who supported the notions of classicism and objectivity in poetry. He won the Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize in 1948. Eliot's critical writings consist mainly of essays, lectures, and reviews. Most of them have been compiled in works like The Sacred Wood that came out in 1920, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism that came out in 1933, Elizabethan Essays in 1934, Poetry and Drama in 1951, The Three Voices of Poetry in 1953, The Frontiers of Criticism in 1956, and On Poetry and Poets in 1957. Traditional Individual Talent is considered to be one of the most seminal essays in Eliot's critical canon. It is hailed as the critical manifesto of Eliot and is a landmark in Eliot's critical thought. The essay was first published in The Egoist in the year 1919. Egoist, the famous literary magazine. It later appeared in the Times Literary Supplement and was later included in the collection of essays called The Sacred Wood. The essay is extremely anti-romantic and provides a theoretical base for modern criticism. So Eliot here is talking about a theory of impersonality and asserts the need for a classical revival. Let's begin with the concept of tradition. In the essay, Traditional Individual Talent, Eliot points out that English people have this tendency to look down upon the concept of tradition. They don't use it in an appreciative manner. Rather, it becomes a term of censure. So when the English people are talking about a traditional work, they're talking about a work that reflects the ideas and techniques of antiquity. And Eliot points out that this tendency to look down upon the concept of tradition is something that is unique to the English race. And he says that it is a part of the critical turn of mind that the English people possess. So, as far as the English people are concerned, they will praise poets for being original and individualistic, but not for being traditional. So, if the poet does not show any influence of the predecessors or the earlier poets, the English would praise him. And Eliot says that this is not the correct method to assess or evaluate a poet. The poet should have a reverence for the established order, for the past. And Eliot points out that the poet's originality consists in his capacity to absorb the spirit in which the predecessors or the earlier poets wrote. So, as far as Eliot is concerned, tradition is not something that should be discarded. It is an idea that should be cherished. Tradition does not imply a blind imitation of the past. It is something that is much more significant, much more important than that. Tradition is not something that you can inherit. It can be acquired only through hard work, great labor. And tradition ideally involves the historical sense, which is a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but its presence. So the historical sense means not only a sense of things as they happened in the past, but also a sense of their relevance in the present. Therefore, it is a sense of the timeless as well as that of the temporal. It creates in the poet a feeling that he has a rich tradition watching over him. So the past, the events in the past do not just stay there. They are constantly influencing the present. And when Eliot is talking about the grand tradition, he is not just talking about the English tradition. He is talking about the whole of the European tradition. That is the legacy that the poets have to carry in their mind. So, no poet can be understood alone. No poet can be judged alone. He has to be seen, he has to be judged with that of his earlier poets. He has to be seen in a process of comparison and contrast with that of the earlier poets. And this judgment is not something that is severe. It is just a process of evaluation. And Eliot also points out that the poet's conformity to tradition is not one-sided. While the poet's work embodies a spirit of tradition, the tradition itself is modified by the introduction of new works. So he explains a system wherein the existing literary works form a perfect pattern among themselves. And each time a new work of art is introduced, this pattern gets readjusted. So this constant interrelation between the old and the new constitutes the vital current of literature. Therefore, you can say that the past is as much altered by the present as the present is altered by the past or directed by the past. So, the poet has to be judged by the standards of the past. The value of a work of art depends on the extent to which it conforms to tradition. So Eliot points out that once a poet is aware of the simultaneous order of literary texts, he will be aware of the great difficulties and responsibilities that go along with this. So these difficulties are due to the fact that he must be judged by the standards of the past. And he says, remember, this is just a judgment, not an amputation. And it is not just a judgment by the canons of the dead critics. It is a judgment in which two things, which are the two things, the old and the new, are measured by each other. Eliot also points out that tradition is something that can be acquired only through conscious effort from the part of the poet. And he says that some can just easily absorb knowledge while others should work for it. And in the essay, he points out that, Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole of British Museum. So a poet should strive to develop this consciousness of the past, and he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. So what Eliot means is that once a poet accepts the significance of the great tradition, he will surrender his individuality. So the progress of an artist, according to Eliot, is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. In the second part of the essay, Eliot introduces the idea of impersonality theory of poetry. He says that poetry is not a turning loose of emotions but an escape from emotions. It is not an expression of personality but an escape from personality. So this is actually a complete rejection of all the ideas put forward by the Romantic movement. Eliot was basically against romantic subjectivism. The Romantic writers looked into their subjective hearts and wrote about their individual feelings, their personal experiences, things like that. But Eliot wanted poetry to be intellectual and objective. So according to Eliot, poets should not try to reveal his subjectivity or his personality through his works. And personal feelings are absolutely irrelevant as far as good poetry is concerned. And Eliot advocated classical ideals of objectivity and perfection. And he also believed that poetry is more important than the poet himself. So the mature poet, the ideal poet, does not have a more interesting personality but a mind which is a more finely perfected medium. So the poet's mind is the ideal receptacle for the birth of poetry. It should be a storehouse, a place where emotions, feelings, thoughts, everything can come together and emerge as a beautiful poem. But in this process, the poet's mind should not become involved because it is just a medium. While explaining the impersonality theory of poetry, Eliot compares the mind of the poet to a catalyst which initiates a chemical reaction or which gives speed to a chemical reaction. And he gives you an example of a chemical reaction. He talks about how sulfur dioxide and oxygen combine together to form sulfurous acid in the presence of a platinum filament. This chemical reaction will take place only if the platinum filament is present. But the platinum itself remains unaffected. It is neutral, it is inert, it doesn't change at all. And the mind of the poet here can be compared to that of the platinum filament. Even when a poet is writing about his own personal experiences, there is always a separation between the man who underwent the experience and the man who is creating the poem. So the perfection of a work of art, a poem, is directly proportional to the degree of objectivity that the poet is able to attain. So what Eliot means is that, like the platinum filament, the poet's mind should just be a medium for creating a poem. It should act as a receptacle for bringing together all the emotions, thoughts, sensations, everything. But as the process takes place, the mind shouldn't be affected. What does he mean? He just means that the poet should not bring in his subjectivity to the end product, which is the poem. Next, we come to the concept of poetic emotion. Explaining the complexity of poetic emotion, Eliot states that the business of the poet is not to find new emotions but to use ordinary ones. And he makes a contrast between artistic emotion, which is rather complex, and personal emotion that can be simple and flat or even crude. So he says that the poet cannot just come up with new emotions every time a new work of art is created. Rather, the poet can convey old emotions but in a complex and concentrated form. So in a creative process, emotions get transformed. What happens is that they form different components of various combinations and permutations. Let's take a look at the concept of objective correlative. The phrase objective correlative occurs in Eliot's essay on Hamlet and his problems. Eliot uses this phrase to explain how emotion can be best expressed in poetry. The poet cannot communicate his emotions directly to the readers. He has to find some object or some event that is suggestive of the emotion, and only then can he evoke the same emotion in his reader. So according to Eliot, the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlate. He defines it as a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts which must terminate in sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. So unless and until the poet comes up with an objective correlative, the emotion cannot be conveyed to the reader. And it is from such a perspective that Eliot considered Hamlet to be defective. He thought that Hamlet was an artistic failure. But Macbeth is successful in finding an objective correlative. In Macbeth, Shakespeare gave the sense of Lady Macbeth's mental agony by making her do the same thing over and over again. So Eliot points out that when compared to Hamlet, Macbeth is an artistic success. We come to the concept of dissociation of sensibility. The term dissociation of sensibility is taken from Eliot's essay on the metaphysical poets. In Eliot's theory of poetry, a union of thought and feeling is very essential. The poet should have a unified sensibility and should transform his thoughts into feelings. This fusion of intellect and emotion is what Eliot terms as unification of sensibility, and this can be found in the metaphysical poets. So Eliot defines unification of sensibility as a direct sensuous apprehension of thought or a recreation of thought into feeling. The poet feels his thought as immediately as the fragrance of a rose. So thought is transformed into feeling to steal its way into the reader's heart. And Eliot points out that both Chapman and Donne had this trait in their poetry. But he says that later poets lack this ability, and there is a consequent split between thought and feeling, which he terms as dissociation of sensibility. I hope all of you understood the major concepts of T.S. Eliot. Thank you.